Arriving at the tail end of 2024, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle marks the triumphant return of Machine Games. This is the studio's largest game to date and the first to deviate from the Wolfenstein series on which its reputation was built. Indiana Jones also arrives after a rather challenging year for Xbox as a brand, delivering exactly the type of game that appeals to folks such as myself who hunger for great single-player experiences. Beyond this, it also gives us our first look at the latest technology developed in tandem between id Software and Machine Games. While it boasts its very own label, this new technology looks to right many of the wrongs we've come to expect from many big AAA games powered by Unreal Engine, including ray-traced global illumination while targeting 60 frames per second at high resolutions. So today I wanted to run through some of the great visual features you can expect both from a technology standpoint and an artistic one, while covering off the nuts and bolts of performance and image quality followed up with some discussion on the game itself. So let's swing into action. With its release during the summer of 1981, it could be argued that Indiana Jones as a franchise grew up alongside video games as a medium. With Harrison Ford so succinctly bringing this dashing character to life, Indy's success would spawn countless offshoots and adjacent products, including video games, the first of which arrived just a year after the film's release on Atari 2600. Raiders of the Lost Ark was a rough and confusing game, but it would be one of many that would attempt to recreate iconic moments from the first film. Which brings us to the modern era. You see, this new game, The Great Circle, is an original story, but it opens in a familiar way. The introduction from Raiders has been meticulously recreated for this new game, and it feels like a statement of intent, as if the designers at Machine Games studied this sequence shot by shot to fully come to grips with the way Steven Spielberg told this story back in the day. By duplicating it anew, the team would have a better idea of how to tell a brand new story in this world. It also allows us to directly compare the film to the game, which in turn reveals some of the game's visual wins. Firstly, unlike prior titles from Machine Games, all cutscenes used in Indiana Jones are rendered entirely in real time, which is a positive step in the right direction. Video-based cutscenes are limited to a maximum possible image quality and often show a mismatch in terms of frame rate and image quality compared to the real-time graphics. So moving away from that is a very good thing. It also demonstrates that, more than I anticipated pre-launch anyways, the character models in this game are largely excellent. There's a surprising amount of visible detail when you look closely at any one model. There is a bit of an uncanny valley element here, but I still feel like the team managed to largely capture the look of the actors. Alfred Molina's legendary portrayal of Satipo during this intro sequence feels surprisingly authentic in the game, with the same over-the-top facial expressions and persistent level of bewilderment as Indiana Jones goes about his business. The animation, expressions, and recreation of iconic camera angles are all beautifully handled during this sequence. But before we continue, there's one issue I wanted to flag. The eagle-eyed among you might have already spotted it, but if you look closely, you'll notice that the game stutters and sometimes drops to what appears to be 30 FPS during some of these cutscenes. So what's going on? Well, bringing this over into our tools reveals that on camera cuts, there are large frame time anomalies, but that's only half the answer. You see, certain animations also momentarily drop to 30 FPS, even though the surrounding scene is still updating at 60, so it's not actually measured here by our tools. The issue is that these two problems sort of detract from otherwise amazing cutscenes, and it's something I really hope they can fix, since it can be a little jarring. It's a shame too, because otherwise, these scenes compare very favorably to the film. Now, in addition to cutscenes, many segments from this introduction are recreated as interactive sequences as well. This allows you to explore the jungle and go to areas that were not in the movie. For instance, after this scene, you can hop right into the water and start swimming around. The water, by the way, looks really great in this game, using a similar geometric mesh system that we saw in the last Wolfenstein game. but with better material properties, reflections, and refractions. There's not a ton of water in the game that I've seen thus far, but what is there generally looks very, very good. And that includes swimming underwater, which you can also do. They also leverage the system to create some really beautiful effects, such as here, where sand is flooding into a chamber threatening to bury Indy beneath the ruins. It seems the same tech powering the water is used to pull this effect off, and it looks pretty awesome. This next scene offers another excellent comparison. So much is communicated without relying on actual speech. It's just a mix of body language, facial expressions, and camera work, and it really sells the tension. Speaking of camera work, the Great Circle offers users 2 aspect ratio options even on console, a full 16:9 option, the default, and an ultra-wide cinematic option. Using the cinematic option gives you a wider aspect ratio and, in this opening scene, more closely matches the film. The 16:9 option crops the left and right of each shot. Now, for most of this video I captured it in 16:9, but for personally playing the game, I have to say the ultra-wide mode feels suitably epic and more cinematic. That is actually my preferred way to enjoy it. I definitely recommend giving both a shot though to see which one works for you. There's other options you can adjust here in the graphics menu as well. You can enable or disable motion blur and chromatic aberration, you can increase the film grain, as well as adjust sharpening. You'll note that there's no option for performance or quality modes either. This is a 60 frames per second game. Now, as we approach the temple, there's another thing I want to highlight here real quick, and it's the quality of the voice work. So Troy Baker steps into the role of Indiana Jones, and listening to them side by side, I was kind of blown away by how closely his voice acting resembles young Harrison Ford.
This is it. This is where Forrestal cashed in.
This is it. This is where Forrestal cashed in.
A friend of yours?
A competitor. He was good. He was very, very good.
Senor.
Friend of yours?
A competitor. He was good. He was very, very good.
Senor.
Nobody has come out of there alive. Please.
Nobody has come out of there alive. Please.
Of course, it's not just Indy. The entire cast is brilliant, and like prior Machine Games titles, original languages are often included. When in Vatican City, for instance, most everyone just speaks Italian. Or in this scene with the villain, he speaks both German initially, and then later accented English. And honestly, I think the performance here is striking. This is definitely an area where Machine Games excels. Take a look.
Es grenzt an Hochverrat! Mir untersteht die gesamte Wehrmacht! Ich könnte sie hier und jetzt erschießen und keiner würde es hinterfragen! Also hinterfragen auch Sie nicht meine Hingabe zum Führer!
Faszinierend. Wo waren die Affengeräusche? Ihren peinlichen Versuch, Dominanz zu zeigen, zu unterstreichen.
Now as we make our way inside, we're treated to a very different scene, an interior space. And once again, they've gone to great lengths to replicate the film. From Indy's eyes when he first notices the spiders, to Satipo's look of horror, it's all perfectly executed. This then eventually leads to another room where we're given an additional close-up of both men and Indy's unfortunate competitor. It's here where I notice the quality of the game's hair rendering. Yeah, this guy may be dead, but his luscious head of hair certainly impresses. This goes for every character, where it's clear that Machine Games has taken great care with rendering out the hair in a realistic, clean manner. It really brings characters to life. Now, it does not actually appear to be using a strand hair system, mind you, as we've seen in many other games lately. It seems to be a traditional card hair system, but the results are so nice that you'd often mistake it as strand hair in some scenes. It's that good. But now as we make our way forward to the next area, we encounter this famous crossing, and if I pause the action here, I want to highlight the next major visual feature, arguably one of the largest ones, ray-traced diffuse global illumination. Essentially, this means that ray tracing is used to calculate indirect lighting from light sources such as the sun. This area, for instance, nicely demonstrates what I'm talking about. Light from outside pours beautifully into this room, filling it with rays, and this information is used to determine the lighting conditions in this space without relying on faked rasterized lighting. As a result, there's no holes or gaps in the scene, there's no light bleed or anything like that. It just feels very naturally lit, with these soft contact shadows and crevices exhibiting the proper shading. Interior scenes with a view to the outdoors benefit tremendously because of this technique. What really surprised me the most, though, is how clean this is. Without something like ray reconstruction, RTGI is usually pretty noisy. When you look at the kind of stuff that Epic's doing with Lumen, for instance, it's a lot less clean looking than what we see here in Indy. Even in high contrast scenes, it's remarkably stable. Yes, in select instances, or if you move around the camera too quickly, you can trigger some slight artifacting, but by and large, it's among the best I've seen. So this is really interesting that in a marked leap from previous id Tech-based games, ray tracing was introduced in Doom Eternal, for instance, but was used only for reflections in that game. Shifting towards proper global illumination has a profound impact on the scenes, and I think it's critical for a game like Indy, which takes place in the past, where you will be exploring many natural locations, often without electric lighting. You want that natural lighting to help bring a scene to life. Of course, ray tracing doesn't come cheap, and as a result, they got rid of the ray-traced reflections we saw in Eternal. It's just the GI now. That means all reflections on things such as water are handled entirely using screen space reflections. Still, the fact that the game runs with ray-traced global illumination at 60 frames per second is an impressive feat, especially true when considering the high average resolution. You see, on Xbox Series X, Indy averages out to around 1800p or so. Dynamic scaling is of course used, as we often see in id Tech games, but every shot I counted came in around 1800p, and I would describe overall image quality as very clean. It's a far cry from titles where we've been seeing resolutions below 1080p when used with ray tracing. Now let's jump back to this scene where they swing over the pit. This is where I'd like to introduce you to the Xbox Series S version. You see, I noticed right away that something was different about the lighting, which sent me down the rabbit hole to get to grips with what Machine Games has achieved here on Series S. After all, optimizing for this console is not a simple task, and if you recall, Doom Eternal was previously lacking ray-traced reflections on this machine. Since ray-traced global illumination is part of the visual makeup of Indy, however, they had to make it work, and they did. It was achieved in multiple ways. So first, there's image quality. Compared to Series X, the S version mostly sits around or below 1080p, which for this little machine is pretty good. But unfortunately, it doesn't hold up as well as it should due to one issue: variable rate shading. VRS had potential, but has been mostly poorly used, resulting in additional blur, noise, and other artifacts that sometimes manifest as if what you were looking at was a poorly encoded video. Doom Eternal had this on Xbox Series consoles as well, but the effect is even worse here. On Series X though, it's honestly not too much of an issue. You will notice it if you look closely, and Alex will have some comparisons to the PC version soon, but with the low resolution of the Series S, the results here are often very poor. The mix of VRS, the lower resolution, and TAA create a very smeary looking game that doesn't hold up on a large display. Even though I'm a big fan of TAA, I don't think it works when the resolution is too low, especially when combined with something like VRS. Of course, the Series S version would look pretty great on a handheld display, don't you think? Hint hint. But obviously, more had to be done. Series S features a smaller install size of 87GB versus 130 on Series X, and this seems to be down to asset quality. Basically, textures take a hit across the board, something you'd expect given the limited memory. Surfaces in general are simply less detailed. This affects both the textures themselves and the MIP level that you see displayed, which is why surfaces like this appear so darn blurry on Series S. Beyond textures, ray tracing has also been reduced in terms of quality. This very first shot here actually demonstrates this. Note the orange light leaking under the hat on Series S. Essentially, it seems to be less precise overall, capturing fewer objects and less detailed objects, resulting in glowing in many scenes. So when we go back to that aforementioned pit, you can instantly see the difference. The S version is lacking that strong white light from the outside. On top of everything else, the shadows also take a hit. They're lower resolution on Series S, as you can see here in this scene. Unfortunately, both machines have issues with the shadow cascade. Look at this scene in the library here. The transition between these two shadow cascades is handled somewhat poorly, resulting in these big, splotchy, ugly shadows popping in and out of existence at a certain distance from the camera. This is a problem on both Series X and Series S. Still, while it's clear that the visuals do take a hit on Series S, I would say they've done a better job than usual creating a version of the game that still plays very well while looking visually okay. Yes, if you have a large 4K display, it doesn't really hold up that well, but that's also not really the intended use case for this machine. It's still a decent version of the game though, and when we get to performance you'll especially see why, but it's kind of what you might expect visually from, say, a handheld PC. Now, as we continue, Indy makes his way into the main chamber. The idol rests before him, leading up to this famous sequence, but first, we must work our way to it. Here, the developers adapted the concept from the film to work within the context of a game. It's fundamentally different, yet still related. Kind of an interesting twist. Once we arrive at the altar, though, we're treated to one of the most iconic scenes in cinema history, recreated entirely in real time. So at this point, we've explored the basic visual makeup across the two Xbox machines, but this initial linear scene, as beautiful as it is, really does just scratch the surface. You see, most of the game takes place in and around these huge open-ended maps. Now, this is not an open world game, mind you, but these maps are vastly larger than anything we've seen from machine games in the past and push the id Tech-derived engine in new ways. Think of it as something like a large Hitman map, and you have an idea of what they're going for. The key here is that on both Xbox Series X and S, the frame rate is virtually unwavering during actual gameplay. It's a locked 60 frames per second, which is quite an achievement, I think. I was able to play this game using black frame insertion on my OLED screen without VRR. That's how stable it was. VRR is not required here. We're looking at a game here with large open maps, ray trace diffuse lighting on both consoles, and it's all still running at a locked 60. That's the magic of id Tech that we love so much, right? Now, the cutscene issue I mentioned earlier in the video is a completely different problem. It doesn't seem to be directly related to performance per se. It's not happening due to hardware failing to keep up, and it is an issue on PC as well. We're still trying to wrap our heads around what's going on there. But aside from that, performance is basically perfect. Now, loading times are also worth mentioning because they're amazingly quick, to the point that there's basically zero visible loading at all. It makes the game feel completely seamless. The whole thing is just very well buttoned up from a performance standpoint. Which then brings me to my thoughts on the design of the game itself. You see, quite honestly, I think this is one of the best licensed games I may have ever played. It's so rare that a developer so completely understands the license on which it's building a game, but it feels like the folks here behind Indy love and respect the property in a big way. The storytelling is, perhaps unsurprisingly, significantly better than the last two films. It's much more grounded too. Don't get me wrong, there are supernatural elements here, but it's kept very much within the realm of something like Raiders of the Lost Ark. The basic structure of the game also allows this to work. Essentially, you'll spend a lot of time in various locations around the globe, such as the Vatican or Giza, kind of like Indy does in the films. Here you'll face a mix of puzzle solving, dialogue, exploration, stealth, combat, and more. The way the game smoothly transitions between linear scripted sequences, like the introduction, to these wide open gameplay areas really gives it this sense of great pacing and plenty of room to breathe. There's even fun side missions, like the one where you steal a black shirt in order to gain entry to an underground boxing arena. It is, as I predicted, a game that kinda shares a lot with the first Riddick title, Escape from Butcher Bay, which some of the staff at Machine Games had previously worked on. But it also has some twists that make it very much Indiana Jones. The stealth system, for instance, is interesting once you get the hang of it. Essentially, Indy can't discreetly take out foes with just his hands. That just initiates a fist fight. Instead, players will need to use objects scattered around the environment to quietly knock out an enemy, such as grabbing a wine bottle or something else and sneaking up behind them before letting them have it. I love the reactions too, like here, notice how he stumbles back off the platform after taking a hit. That's cool stuff. Or in this scene, the way the enemy catches this hammer that I tossed at him. A move that usually works, but in this case, expectations are kind of subverted when the enemy counters it. The stealth AI is largely good, but very much in a video game sense. By that I mean they aren't actually all that responsive. There's a large gray area. Eliminate an enemy near another one and they likely won't even notice it. It seems a bit silly at first, honestly, but the opposite, hypersensitive enemies, would have been a lot less fun, I think. Stealth was nearly impossible to enjoy in Wolfenstein 2, The New Colossus, but here it works very well. Indie is all about rewarding experimentation, allowing players to fumble around while taking down foes along the way. Guns are in the game, but rarely used, especially early on, but there's always the option to use it. Fire off a few rounds in an enemy base, for instance, and you'll wind up alerting everyone. They'll try to hunt you down, and it becomes much more of an action game at this point, with Indy trying to survive. The key here is that the game kind of leaves it up to the player to figure out how they want to tackle each area. This is all good stuff, I think, but I do have a couple minor gripes. Firstly, while it is polished overall, I did encounter some minor bugs and visual anomalies from time to time. For instance, after this cutscene, this happened. I don't think her legs are supposed to be there. The scene didn't break or anything, but that's not good. And some of the animations used for taking out an enemy create some awkward looking moments. The last thing I wanted to include though was a quick demonstration of the audio in this game. I already showcased the voice acting earlier in this video, but I want you to listen to the rest of the sound. The first one, for instance, takes place in this old temple. Pay close attention to the ambiance, the reverb, and how the characters' distance from one another influences the sound and volume of their voice.
Need some kind of key to open.
The shield on the statue moved.
You can hear a similar thing to how voices are impacted by the environment in this next clip.
Der Stein muss hier sein. Das sind die Koordinaten. Keine Sorge, wir finden ihn. Die Zeit haben wir nicht. Hört nur, wie das Schiff ächzt. Ist da jemand? Na, ist auch egal.
Then there's the more bombastic action scenes that you get from time to time.
By the tunnel! I see her! Into the tunnel! Watch out!
Or heck, even just that introduction section that we focused on a lot in this video, it sounds beautiful with a great combination of music and ambiance to create a cohesive whole. So yeah, audio, it's another area where Machine Games just managed to perfectly capture the essence of Indiana Jones. So that's the big takeaway from me here. They really did manage to pull it off. I had wanted a game like this for such a long time. Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis from LucasArts, for instance, is one of the first video games I ever purchased with my own money, and I cherished it. It's a great adventure game. I enjoyed subsequent indie games as well, mind you, but The Great Circle outdoes every one of them. It truly successfully channels the spirit of Indiana Jones in game form. When you really look at the various pieces together though, this also feels like the spiritual successor to The Chronicles of Riddick: Escape from Butcher Bay. If that sounds like a good time to you, definitely give this one a look. One final thing I wanted to mention. Alex is currently hard at work on the PC video for Indiana Jones. And although the full ray tracing option, aka path tracing, is not yet available, he already found some interesting differences between Series X and the PC version, where things like the RTGI setting on Xbox is lower than the lowest possible setting on PC. You can see in several of these scenes that there's more robust lighting and shadowing happening on the PC side, even without full ray tracing. So if you're curious how the game stacks up on more powerful hardware, Alex has you covered with his upcoming video. So look forward to it. But that's going to do it for this video, so I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.